Have you ever wondered or asked yourself, is the Torah true? Or perhaps the Torah was the fabrication of a man by the name of Moshe. He developed a very interesting story, some very significant moral and ethical rules and regulations, but that's about as far as it goes. And in many ways it is not dissimilar from this perspective to other religions. It's purely based on the musings of an individual. And whilst it may have much value to it, there's a big difference between something being of value and something being divine. Well, it's a legitimate question. And it's a question which, in many ways, is answered in this week's parsha. You see, this week's parsha deals towards the end with the laws of kashrut that we are all so familiar with. It articulates the various different animals that are not kosher. It gives us the criteria for the kosher animals: chew their cud and have split hooves. It then advances later on to discuss fish. Which fish we are allowed to eat and which fish we're not allowed to eat. And the Torah articulates kol asher lo snapir v'kaskeset. Everything that has fins and scales, you're allowed to eat. If it doesn't have fins and scales, you're not allowed. Is naturally precluded from us, and many of the other things that exist in the ocean are precluded. Whilst one may ask the question that I already highlighted with regards to the Chumash, one could in fact ask it even more so with regards to anything that is articulated later on, specifically in the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. That this is indeed perhaps nothing more, nothing less than the deliberations of mere mortals, and does not contain within it any divine insight, any divine thought process. And therefore it's very engaging when we look at what our rabbis tell us with regards to fish. Our rabbis highlight that whilst the Torah requires that the fish that we eat have both fins and scales, the rabbis mention to us that if you find a fish that is devoid of any fins but it has scales, then you should know that it is kosher. And even though the Torah requires both fins and scales, the rabbis of old mentioned and pointed out that it is impossible to have a fish that has only scales and no fins, whilst it is certainly possible to have fins but no scales, as you can see certainly with regards to dolphins and various other fish. With regards to a kosher fish, if you see that it's got scales, even though it's lost all of its fins, they've been removed, you can rest assured that it is kosher. It's a very bold statement to make some 2,000 years ago. And then what makes it so bold is what kind of a knowledge could they have had with regards to the various life sources that exist in the oceans? What was available to them in those days in terms of the fishing that they could do? How deep could they go? I mean, possibly if you were to do deep sea fishing, as one can do now, and you would really go down to the abyss and cast a net, you would draw up fish that have scales and no fins. Surely it is very easy to determine whether the rabbis were right or whether they were wrong. They could not have articulated this with a certainty based on oceanographic information. The only way they could know this was by divine insight. And this statement is 100% true. As we speak, with all of our technology and all of our ability to get down into the deepest oceans, we have not yet come across a fish that has scales and no fins. So science today in the 21st century has not been able to disprove that which our rabbis articulated 2,000 years ago. So that at the very least indicates to us that the rabbinic writings were not the musings of intelligent individuals, but rather divinely inspired. And perhaps, if one were to go back to how we started, with regards to a question to the veracity and the divinity of the Torah itself, we go not to the fish, but indeed to the animal kingdom. Again, here we are dealing with a man by the name of Moshe. His entire exposure to the world was limited to Egypt and Midian. He wasn't well traveled. He'd never been to the Himalayas. He'd never been to darkest Africa. He'd never been to the Americas, to Asia, to Russia. He'd never been to any of these places. How could he so definitively say that there are but 4 animals which either chew their cud but do not have split hooves, or have split hooves but do not chew their cud? How could he be so certain? And who in their right mind would ever write for all eternity, would ever put it down in black and white, a declaration and a statement, which could so easily be disproven as time progresses, as man advances across the globe and encounters an array of animals, of life creatures that you'd never see in a desert environment. Maybe there are many more, hundreds if not thousands of animals that either chew their cud but do not have split hooves, or vice versa. Because the Torah states very clearly, any animal that chews its cud and has split hooves, you may eat. If they do not have either of those, it goes without saying that they're treif. But what happens if it has one but not the other? So the Torah says that is indeed a legitimate and a good question. And you should know that there are but 4. By way of an example, the pig has split hooves, but it doesn't chew its cud. The camel chews its cud, but doesn't have split hooves, as well as the other 2, which only have one but not the other. The Torah isolates these 4 as the only 4 living creatures that carry one but not both, and one but not neither of the 2 critical components to make an animal kosher. Which mere mortal in their right mind, who is writing a book for all generations, would ever have the temerity and the audacity to put down something like that, which can so easily be disproved? There was only one being at that point in time that had that kind of knowledge available, that was able to say with absolute certainty that there is no such thing besides these 4 animals as an animal which has one but not the other, and that being is none other than God. And therefore it was God who wrote our Holy Torah. And there is only one being that could provide us with the knowledge that there is no fish on this planet that has scales and no fins other than the Creator Himself, the one who can testify and say that if it has scales, it must have had fins and it must be kosher. And perhaps we can finish off with one final point that will drive home to all of us the absolute certainty that the Torah is nothing short of God's divine will and knowledge being articulated and expressed throughout the ages, commencing with the Torah and coming through to our very times. And that is the question of the Arnevet. The Arnevet is the 3rd of the species which it says chew their cud but does not have split hooves. Now all of us who've seen those cuddly little rabbits will know very well that they don't have a split hoof. But it seems very strange, because a cursory knowledge of the anatomy of a rabbit will make us aware that unlike animals that chew their cud, a rabbit does not have 4 stomachs. And therefore the rabbit per se has neither. It neither chews its cud nor has split hooves, and therefore seems to be totally out of place. And perhaps, if one would be so unbashful to say, is a mistake in the Torah. And probably for centuries there were those who may have thought this. To my knowledge, in the 1970s, a study was done on these particular animals, on rabbits. And the study showed something very fascinating. A rabbit does not chew its food and that's the end of the story. But rather the rabbit chews the food, regurgitates the food, and eats it again. That is exactly what chewing your cud means. No one could have known that. This is something that is so oblique, something so unknown until the 70s, the 1970s. But the author of the Torah was totally aware of this. No human author could ever get it so right. And therefore this week's parasha in the laws of a kashrut present to each and every one of us an unflappable proof in the divinity of the Torah, the immortality of the Torah. And it shows to us that the Torah was not the musings of a very sane and very moral individual, but rather encapsulates wisdom that only the divine Creator could know. And therefore our Torah is nothing short of God's divine will, or in the words of our sages, Ritzono v'chochmato shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It is God's divine will, God's divine knowledge, and our Torah is eternal, our Torah is immortal, because our Torah is divine. Good Shabbos.